Hello, all you Vandals, Visigoths, and uncivilized barbarians. It's time to talk about art and culture for a new century, as well as some technology that will sort of sprinkle in the middle. The basic thing that you should keep in mind when we're talking about this is that most art and culture during this time period is a response to, or in some ways a connection to, the things that we've already observed during the late 1800s. The fact that America is becoming more urban and more industrial. And the thing is that creates some degree of nostalgia. We talked about that with the emergence of Romantic art in the early to mid 19th century, and we're going to see more of that going forward. Now, this is going to be kind of just a dip into the pool, a pretty shallow pool too. Unfortunately, there's just tons of stuff that we would love to talk about but can't. But the first thing that we should kind of mention is that obviously, with the Second Industrial Revolution, we see the emergence of new forms of technology. And we also talked about the fact that technology itself, inventing, becomes big business. So let's go ahead and put Thomas Edison, as well as Nikola Tesla, into your notes as some kind of figures that are sort of emblematic of this process. So Thomas Edison and Tesla are not necessarily memorable because they were incredible inventors, though they certainly were, but as an example of how invention has become industrialized and tied to the development of industries during this time period. And so Menlo Park, which is the laboratory that Thomas Edison owned, not only is it credited with the development of the incandescent light bulb, which is pretty big on its own, but also Edison himself holds a patent for the phonograph and the motion picture. So technology itself, once again, is big business during this time period. And of course, that's just the tip of the iceberg. So a lot of the things that we associate with the development of the modern world is developed during this really golden period in terms of human innovation, the period from the late 19th to the early 20th century. And it kind of comes in just like this wave, just about. So Carl Benz, admittedly, this is more of a European history point, but there's an American history point in a minute, is credited with the development of the automobile, I think in the 1890s. And of course, that is coming on sort of in the midst of this other sort of wave of technological innovation. You have the development of radio communication in the year 1900, which also means that provided you have a broadcast station, you don't necessarily need telegraph lines in order to electronically send messages. You can do so without necessarily having as much infrastructure built up. Now, of course, it takes a while for that infrastructure to be built up because obviously you need radio stations, that kind of thing. But around the 1920s, radio sort of makes a big splash and it becomes kind of the country's default form of entertainment before the television. Obviously, we have the flight of the Wright brothers' first aircraft in Kitty Hawk, North Carolina. It's going to take a while for the aeroplane to actually become practical, but still, we've managed to fly. And by the way, the hot air balloon kind of gets, ignored here because, of course, manned flight actually dates back to the French Revolution with the development of the Montgolfier. But fortunately, Orville and Wilbur Wright's little glider does become a little bit more sophisticated, but we're not going to see just how sophisticated the airplane can become until the First World War. Now, going back though, the automobile is still really primitive. There's not much reason to pick the automobile, or the horseless carriage, I guess you could call it, over the railroad. But there's a couple of things that happen in the turn of the century that make the automobile kind of the preferred form of transportation for Americans going forward. So this story requires us to introduce Henry Ford. Now, if you were to ask many people Americans or people across the world who invented the car, they might say that it's Henry Ford. And I think that historical error says it all. Henry Ford doesn't invent the car, but he basically invents everything that makes the car work. Because by the time Henry Ford really starts tinkering with the automobile itself is pretty old tech. It's over 2 decades old at this point. And one of the reasons why Henry Ford is so associated with the automobile success is that the automobile before Ford just wasn't practical. The automobile was, I suppose, useful or practical for people with a lot of money, for people who wanted to move around cities or the countryside unencumbered by railways. But the automobile was ridiculously expensive. So expensive, in fact, that it really didn't make much sense to build roads to accommodate the car. And in fact, for most people, the train was still the most practical and efficient means of transportation during this time period. Now let's introduce Henry Ford. Henry Ford, in a lot of respects, is the ultimate industrialist and robber baron. Guy was the first billionaire, basically developed the American auto industry. But what's really fascinating about Ford is that Ford is not a typical robber baron. And we already talked about the fact that the robber barons themselves are hard to kind of typecast. But Ford himself actually comes from rural Michigan. In other words, the same territory or stretch that tended to be so suspicious of the robber barons. I don't think that Ford's parents were necessarily like populist or grangers, but they were farmers. And we also know that farmers in the Midwest kind of have a love-hate relationship with, do you remember 3 a.m.? The railroad. Because the railroad is essential for farmers now, starting with the mid-19th century, to move their goods from point A to point B. So what Ford remembers, though, is that his parents had to work very hard trying to get their goods from point A to point B. And so Ford understands that not being dependent upon the railroad will be a game changer for farmers. Like, what if every farmer could have their own personalized transportation that didn't depend upon the fickle whims of railroads like the Union Pacific? So that's kind of where his perspective is rooted. He's not thinking about mass transit in cities. He's not thinking about creating suburban living. What he's trying to do is revolutionize life for farmers. And by the way, what's really fascinating about Ford is that Ford is a really bright, sort of naturally mechanical kid whose mind is being wasted on the farm. He tries to kind of do everything he can to get away from the farm, which eventually leads him to start working in the infantile auto industry in Michigan. So Ford and a team developed what is called the Ford Model T. Now, the Ford Model T isn't the best car out there, but what it is, though, is it's something that's incredibly affordable for most Americans. If you were to look at the average cost of a car during that time period, it was something like $2,000. In other words, $2,000 is, more than most people made in an entire year. And unless you had a lot in savings or could get credit, it just wasn't affordable to most people. So before Ford, the auto industry in the United States and across the pond in Europe, it tended to be an industry that was not that far removed from the craft guilds of medieval Europe. In other words, you have artisans that handcraft a high quality good rather than a good that can be manufactured quickly, cheaply, and efficiently. And that's what Ford brings to the table. Ford develops a car with standardized parts that can be manufactured on the assembly line. And basically, the assembly line is kind of an expansion off of Eli Whitney's concept of interchangeable parts. But not only do you have interchangeable parts, you have people that basically only have to do one job over and over. And that means that you don't necessarily need as much high quality labor, and your labor can be can be done very, very cheaply. The problem, though, is that if you just have people pushing like a one button over and over again, for example, that's kind of mind-numbing, and worker morale can get very, very low. And so you either have to end the assembly line process, which would make the cost of the Model T increase, or you have to give them a reason, the workers a reason, to stay and do the same mind-numbing job over and over. And that is where Henry Ford happens upon an idea that is absolutely bonkers, but absolutely brilliant. Pay them more. And not just pay them more, pay them a lot more. Pay every single worker $5 a day. Doesn't matter if they have college degrees. Nobody has college degrees then. Not really. Doesn't matter if they have high school education. Doesn't matter what skills they have or don't have. No. Pay every worker at the very least $5 a day. Now, again, we're talking in terms of, dollars in the 19 teens. And so $5 a day doesn't necessarily mean much to us right now. But just in comparison, you're talking about paying somebody the equivalent of, let me look at my notes here, $130 to $150 a day. In other words, a type of revenue or income that's only possible for people with 4-year degrees. And by the way, everybody thought Ford was crazy. But here's Ford's mindset. If workers are able to get that much, one, you don't have to constantly retrain people as they're quitting their jobs because they're making so much money that they're okay sort of going through mind-numbing work, right? Because everything has a price tag, including the human brain, I suppose. But Ford also realizes that if you give workers that amount of money, they can turn around and purchase the very cars they help build. And a lot of them do. So this actually becomes something that makes the automotive industry incredibly efficient. Cheap cars, but highly paid laborers. And by the way, eventually, what this is going to do is, one, Ford becomes the first billionaire, but two, it means that the American auto industry leads the world, and leads the world, by the way, up until after the end of the Second World War. But we're beginning to see something that eventually will come back around to kind of bite us during the Great Depression, and that is that so much of the American economy will be tied up into the automotive industry going forward. Now, the automotive industry is becoming incredibly efficient, too efficient, in fact. And eventually it reaches a point where everybody who wants a car can afford a car. And if you're expecting an industry to continue to expand over time, that's going to create a problem. But it's not a problem right now, because right now, Ford and his motor company lead the world in automotive production, but not just automotive production, industrial production in general. Detroit, Michigan becomes almost like a holy city of industry. It becomes like easily the most industrialized city on planet Earth until roughly at the end of the Second World War. Now, we also remember Henry Ford for having very paternalistic views on race, culture, and immigration. Ford himself is a proponent of the melting pot idea, the idea that the United States is going to be a safe haven for people around the world. And, of course, that should make sense because Ford is probably the greatest in some respects of the robber barons, and we also know that many industrialists liked hiring immigrants because of the fact that immigrants could be exploited for low wages. Now, In Ford's case, remember, Ford was a proponent of, actually paying workers fairly high wages. So he's not really coming at it from that angle. Interestingly, what Ford kind of uses as leverage is the fact that if you're paying somebody $5 a day, let's just say that Ford feels like he can make other demands of his workers. And so Ford encourages his workers to basically go to a school to learn American English, and also to kind of encourage them to assimilate into American society. And we can kind of see this in what's called these melting pot ceremonies that were held after people graduated from the Ford English School. And the way this stuff would work is that people would go up wearing clothing that was sort of part of their traditional culture, and then they would go into this melting pot, and then they would come out in traditional American clothing. So the idea, though, is it's not unlike the Carlisle Indian School, where on the one hand, Native Americans are embraced as being human, but on the other hand, every attempt is made to suppress Native American culture. Speaking of cultural repression, one thing that's kind of interesting to note is that African Americans developed new opportunities for employment and expression during the late 19th and early 20th centuries. So we talked about the fact that saloons are popping up all over the United States, and this is, among other things, led to a backlash, which will eventually culminate in the 18th Amendment, the Prohibition Amendment. That being said, though, the growth of saloon culture has kind of created a high demand for trained musicians. And so one of the things we kind of see is the employment of African American musicians who develop entirely new musical genres, which among other things, we have, by the way, some of my examples of this are listed in the video section for this lecture. You should take a listen to it, actually. But basically, these musical styles include ragtimes, which eventually evolves into jazz by the 1920s. But the thing is that jazz music is actually a musical style that's sort of developed by African Americans along the Mississippi River, if we're being honest. And by the way, we're also going to see a very similar development with rock and roll, which originates as basically blues, which is predominantly an African American genre of music, and again, eventually that develops into rock and roll. But I've basically linked you to the works of Jelly Roll Morton, who is commonly considered the father of jazz, and some of you have probably heard of Scott Joplin, and or at least even if you haven't heard of Scott Joplin, I assure you that the video that I linked in the calendar is something that you should be familiar with. With the emergence of the Ford Motor Company and saloons, if you didn't know it already, you could probably guess that America has become more urban. Now, the thing is that as America becomes more urban, it means that more people are working in cities. And the thing is that if you're working in cities and in factories, it creates a very peculiar problem, which is after you have worked your 8 to 12 hours, what do you do in your off time? In rural America, problem solved. You work more because there's always something that you can do. But in industrial America, well, if you work more beyond your shift, I mean, you're not getting paid for that. And you don't really own your own land, especially if you are a renter. So then the question is, well, what do you do? And the answer to that question, that question is answered by a few different developments. One is the emergence of saloon culture, where people would go after work to drink. And of course, we talked about the inevitable backlash to all that. But something that was considered more wholesome was the development of organized sports. Now, listen to me very carefully, sports have always been a thing. That being said, though, we don't really see sports become significant, or organized sports at the national level become significant until the late 19th to early 20th centuries. And we can kind of pick up on a couple of developments that happen alongside of it. One, we know from the YMCA that the YMCA was established because of concerns of what city life would do to the character of ordinary people. That, city life was seen as somehow corrupting. And what could be more wholesome than sports? Now, that being said, some of the sports we're really talking about haven't been invented yet, but we have the development of sports like basketball. And basketball, fortunately, is not something that requires a lot of physical space to play, which is ideal in an urban environment. But this is accompanied by sort of the institutionalization of sports that are a bit more spacious or require a little bit more space, like baseball. Baseball is actually a very old sport. It kind of comes from both the UK and the US as rounders. Eventually, the British sort of, have an offshoot called cricket. But we have records of, soldiers in the Civil War playing baseball, only for games to be interrupted once the other side opens fire. And then, of course, once the shooting ends, the baseball recommences. But baseball is actually just kind of like the ultimate sport for the industrial age. And of course, the fact that Major League Baseball is established in 1903, kind of in the peak of American industrialization, kind of bears this out. Because if you think about what baseball is that baseball isn't necessarily the most gripping sport. It's not a sport where you have a lot of buildup and drama and these sudden epic plays like you do in football, for example. Baseball is like this steady stream of action. Now, if you listen to Ken Burns' documentary on baseball, which, if you're a fan of the sport, I really suggest you do. It's pretty good. But some of the commentators there have pointed out that, baseball is not a sport that's designed to be watched on TV. It's a sport that's designed to be seen in a stadium. It's a opportunity to kind of engage with other members of your community, to see how your neighbors are doing. It's not a sport in which you constantly have to watch because obviously there's a lot of off time, so you can talk with your neighbors and your friends. And it's a sport that goes on for a while by design. Sports aren't really required to, come to a close until the advent of TV, where every second is valuable advertising, right? But baseball is really made for an entire new era. It's also a very industrialized sport. It's about performing a series of consistent actions with as few mistakes possible. Because remember, if you make mistakes, if you get 3 strikes, then your team loses the ability to score runs. So baseball is kind of the ultimate sport for the industrial era. Now, you might be wondering, what about football? Football doesn't really develop until the 1920s, and also football is kind of dependent upon the emergence of undergraduate education. That football is something that begins on college campuses, and eventually it develops into something a little bit more significant, really after the Second World War and with the development of TV. If baseball is the ultimate sport for the industrial era, football is the ultimate sport for the television era. So if sport is a response to urbanization, then certainly art is as well. And we kind of see this come up in surprising ways. This is maybe the first and only time we will talk about architects and landscapers in this course. And of course, I'm going to mention the one architect that basically everybody knows, Frank Lloyd Wright. But remember that cities, in some cases, double in size at the low end to increase over 1,000% in the case of San Francisco during just a very small window of time. And remember that this growth is very organic, it's not really planned. And the other thing that happens is that suddenly real estate costs increase. And of course, if you are living in the 10th ward of New York City, then your experience is going to be very different than somebody who resides in, let's say in the middle of Manhattan. So this is one of the reasons why we see the development of Central Park, which is planned by a landscape architect by the name of Frederick Law Olmsted. Now, Central Park is this rather large park in the middle of New York City, but we have to kind of look at it in two different ways. On the one hand, we kind of see this return to nature, this nostalgia for nature in the design of Central Park. But the other thing is that it is kind of designed to reinforce ideas of equality, that Central Park is a public park in a city that is kind of the face of this privatized capitalist economy. And so the idea is that you have a park that is accessible to everybody in the city, regardless of what social class they're from. Now, with Frank Lloyd Wright, you see the emergence of the Prairie School of architecture. And basically, the thing to kind of remember is that it's a school that tries to synthesize buildings with nature. And so we can kind of almost see this as a romantic throwback or nostalgia for the type of nature that's been lost as America becomes more and more urban. Now, if we move to paintings, which is kind of the most traditional form of art that we probably think of, paintings during this time period are responding to a couple of different developments. One is, yes, industry and urbanization, but also the question is, what is the reason for living? What is the raison d'etre? Nice phrase for you, of paintings during this time period after the development of the photograph. So we see a couple of different developments here. One development is probably something that you guys are kind of familiar with, and that is the emergence of Impressionism. So with Impressionism, you have vibrant colors and brushstrokes that are not trying to create a photorealistic image, but instead you're using colors and brushstrokes to evoke the feeling that an image gives you. It's kind of a little bit more idealized. Now, of course, Impressionism is not a uniquely American art style. There are very few art styles that are uniquely American, but we see that Impressionism really centers around France, and of course you sort of see American Impressionism sort of branch off from that. But again, it's, this is probably a great example here where you don't have the great sort of facial details like you did with the Romantics, right? It's not a realistic art form. Instead, you see characters that are kind of idealized and kind of a fantastical setting. It seems a little hazy and almost whimsical, dreamlike, almost. Now, what happens, though, is that towards the end of the 19th century, there is this sort of backlash against Impressionism led by artists like Robert Henry and John Sloan, and it's called the Ashcan School of Realism. Basically, the argument is that Impressionism doesn't really adequately describe what life is like for most Americans. I mean, if we were idealizing what most people experience on a daily basis, like, cool trips at the beach, for example, that would be one thing. But Robert Henry rejected Impressionism because it just didn't see it was almost like an art form that, as he put it, was too academic. In other words, it was almost like Impressionism was an ivory tower style of art that didn't really resonate with ordinary people. And so with the Ashcan School of Realism, we see kind of like this much more brutal depiction of life. And I don't mean brutal as in you see like, dead bodies or things like that around. I mean, I guess you could, but in other words, we see almost like this colder depiction of life in cities. And by the way, I mean, just look at that picture where everything looks like a Charles Dickens dystopia. That doesn't mean that all paintings during this time period were very depressing. But you could almost kind of think of the Ashcan school as almost like an inverse of Impressionism, where you're using a lot of the same brushstrokes, but instead of using vibrant colors to depict an idealized form of life, you're using those same techniques to kind of demonstrate maybe a deeper truth about life, and maybe trying to make almost be more realistic than the realist in some respects. So the Ashcan school is kind of a rejection of Impressionism and the romantic art that preceded it, which is usually lofty, idealized. It usually sort of dwells on mythology and heroic characters. And the Ashcan school just doesn't. It's trying to depict everyday life for ordinary people who may be heroic, but most likely they're not. We see a very similar development happen in literature, though. And of course, it's a development that we call literary realism, which is kind of its, I guess you could call it a literary style. So literary realism is basically the same principle. And by the way, it shouldn't be surprising that authors during this time period are trying to sort of focus on everyday problems. Remember that this is kind of the high tide of progressive journalism and muckrakers. And many of them were not just newspaper reporters, but they were also authors of popular fiction. And remember that the lines between those two things often blurred together. Journalists like Upton Sinclair would sometimes sort of take condensed versions of their experiences and they would publish them as novels. And that is basically the jungle in a nutshell. So again, fiction and news reporting, it's blended together. And it doesn't necessarily mean that the news becomes fictional or that, books and novels specifically become entirely objective. It's not that. It's just that suddenly there is this appetite for stories that kind of dwell on issues and problems that ordinary Americans face. And so probably the earliest example of this, arguably, is Mark Twain, who, among other things, writes the book The Prince and the Pauper, which is kind of a story about, among other things, class conflict. But also, he's most known for writing the stories of Tom Sawyer and Huckleberry Finn. And again, these stories depict protagonists who are deeply flawed, and in I think both cases of Tom Sawyer and Huckleberry Finn, deeply racist. But they basically depict them as kind of everyman protagonists. So you also have other sort of examples of this. Jack London writes the book The Call of the Wild. London himself, by the way, was also a newspaper reporter during this time period. And Call of the Wild is not just a story that's sort of set in this style of literary realism. It's also a story that we can kind of call an example of naturalism. My terrible short summary of Call of the Wild is that it revolves around a protagonist who is a sled dog named Buck, who basically becomes a sled dog, competes with another sled dog who he does not get along with, fights that sled dog, kills the sled dog, and becomes leader of the pack. It's a story of a dog who's basically sent from an urban that's very protected and closed off into a natural one. And by being exposed to the harsh realities of the cold of the Klondike Mountains, Buck is able to sort of become greater than he was in the beginning of the story. So there's a couple things we can kind of glean from Call of the Wild. The first is that Call of the Wild features a protagonist that doesn't succeed because he's necessarily good, but because he just happens to win out based upon, the lottery of social Darwinism. That Buck was fit to survive, his opponent was not. And by being exposed to those natural pressures in the wild, as opposed to being, kind of sheltered in the safer cities, Buck is able to become better than he was. So we kind of see that in the Call of the Wild, it's partially a critique of industrialization. I know that there are probably English teachers who are going to hear this and cringe at that gross simplification. I get it, but for our purposes right now, we can probably at least say that. The Call of the Wild is maybe asking Americans that, on the one hand, or prompting Americans to think about what they have gained through industry and urbanization, but also think maybe about what they've lost in that process as well. So, continuing this tour of gross literary simplification, we have the works of Theodore Dreiser, most notably Sister Carrie and An American Tragedy. Again, I'm usually just picking a couple of salient points from each author to kind of show how literature is evolving. And if you have further questions on style, ask me, or better yet, ask your English teacher. But what we can say about Theodore Dreiser is that Theodore Dreiser is kind of writing anti-Victorian fiction. Remember that during the Victorian era, we have concepts like Victorian morality, where sexuality is kind of frowned upon. And repressed. Theodore Dreiser writes books that are usually set in urban settings with characters that very often engage in illicit sexual relationships that are sort of outside of marriage, which was very controversial during that time period. So one of the things we kind of see is that we see this shift away from Victorian morality, at least in Dreiser's books. And it's for that reason that they're kind of used as an example of literary realism. So one minor note during this time period is that we see the development of Nickelodeon. Okay, so maybe not this Nickelodeon, but Nickel Theaters, also known as Nickelodeons, Odeon being the Greek word for theater, that becomes a thing because, hey, we got movies now. In fact, the term movie is in itself kind of arbitrary and up for debate because what we kind of consider movies today are actually not at all what movies were back in the day. So basically, after Thomas Edison develops motion picture capture, there's like this craze for taking film version of like everyday activities. And by the way, in some respects, the filmmakers that we see during this early time period are not unlike YouTube filmmakers today, where they were usually like individualistic and they were going out and sort of taking videos of common everyday things. So, for example, people would go to theaters just to watch there was a 30-second video of people kissing, and people just ate it up because of the novelty factor. I mean, yeah, I get the fact that that seems really strange, but just think about all that weird stuff you've probably seen on TikTok and have, watched and rewatched, and maybe you'll have some sympathy for the poor saps who go out and watch movies and and have such low standards. But we also see some movies with some impressive production values. If you want, you can watch either Voyage to the Moon or The Great Train Robbery. I've linked them both in the course videos to this lecture. Now, most of these early films were incredibly short. I think The Great Train Robbery is something like 7 minutes. Voyage to the Moon is less than 10 minutes. By the way, you should watch Voyage to the Moon. It's really funny. In other words, the movies that we're talking about don't really resemble movies like we have today. Until this comes out. D.W. Griffith's Birth of a Nation, which we've already talked about. you can kind of think of Birth of a Nation as almost being like the equivalent of Star Wars when Star Wars came out in 1977. It's an epic story that revolutionizes special effects. The movie itself lasts for over 3 hours. It features like a full-scale battle sequence, and it pioneers some of the cinematic techniques that we have today, including a pan shot over a battlefield, where the camera kind of moves and swivels from one point to another. Again, there was nothing like Birth of a Nation. But, of course, that's not really why we bring it up, because the fact is that Birth of a Nation is a film about American history from the perspective of the lost cause. The idea is that the Civil War was a victory of, cold and cruel and corrupt Northern politicians over, a gallant and valorous South. And of course, during Reconstruction, D.W. Griffith depicts that Southerners are only protected by the Knights of the Ku Klux Klan. African Americans feature in the film, I'm going to use air quotes, because they were portrayed by white actors using blackface. And African Americans are usually portrayed as not having their own agency, as being kind of pawns of Northern politicians in that film. Now, what is so shocking about this, though, is not only the fact that the film was made, but the fact that President Woodrow Wilson has apparently taken with this film so much that he organizes a private screening at the White House. And of course, we'll sort of talk about that more a bit later on. The fact that Woodrow Wilson reverses a lot of political rights for African Americans. He resegregates the White House, for example. So what happens is that we talked about the fact that before Birth of a Nation, the Ku Klux Klan looked, in terms of their costuming, very differently than they do today. And so in 1915, the KKK wasn't really a serious organization. But after the First World War, the Ku Klux Klan is rebirthed in a very serious way. And that's in part inspired by its depiction in Griffith's Birth of a Nation. So we can kind of see how art is changing life in the United States, but we can also see terrifying depictions that involve people sort of glamorizing a world that never existed in Griffith's Birth of a Nation. So that's where we'll leave it. I will see y'all next time.